I want to talk a little bit about driving your boosted car, things not to do, and there are numerous articles online about how not to drive your car. One of them, many of them, state one of these things, and they say don't lug the engine, and don't drive into high gear, you know, 4th, 5th, or 6th, at low RPM and hold it to the floor and wait for boost to happen. There's a lot of reasons behind that, and some of them can be completely negated by your tuner, and some of them can't. And the reason for that is that the ECUs on some of these cars are only so complex, they don't give us the ability to do it. Or at least they don't give us the ability to compensate for that environment while at the same time providing you good performance in the lower gears. And what I mean by that is mostly in regards to boost response. Not everyone knows, but the higher the gear you're in, the more load on the car. The lower in the RPM range, the turbo will hit full boost. That's just a function of the acceleration rate being not very high in a high gear due to the less torque, and then the increased load allowing the turbo time to spool up and exchange air, you know, through the engine, and then build boost faster. So on a normal tune, the tuner will usually do 4th gear pulls to set the majority of the calibration. And during that time, we're trying to get the calibration in such a way that the turbo makes boost as fast as it can. There's always, you know, a bit of lag to a turbo, and especially with big turbos, we want to ensure that the customer has the least amount of lag because it sucks to wait for boost. So in order to do so, there's a few tricks that tuners do, and even the factory does. They run a very high wastegate duty cycle at a lower RPM to help port air away from the wastegate itself to minimize the chance it's going to open prematurely, and in some cases port air to the top of the gate to hold it shut more to minimize any leakage, and therefore provide the most exhaust pressure available to spin the turbo as fast as possible. So that table looks like this. This is something I pulled off the internet really quick. It's not one of mine. I don't know if it's going to focus or not. But what we have across the top is usually throttle percentage is the typical, and then in here we'd have RPM. And so what we're saying on this table is that this person here put 90% duty cycle here at the high throttle input. So when the person driving is requesting torque, right, they're requesting boost, in a range that's where the turbo doesn't normally provide it, the calibrator puts a lot of duty cycle in here to try and get that exhaust pressure up and hope spin the turbo up faster. And then as the turbo is approaching its peak boost, you drop the duty cycle down to the right value that would control the turbo boost, so that hopefully your boost curve looks like this. Okay, and I found these two coincidentally kind of coincide with what the boost curve would look like and the programming for it. Now, what this means is that right here on 4,000 RPM, when you see boost comes in, is right about its peak, right there. It actually coincides with this graph where the tuner has 90 less than 4,000, and 4,000 he's got it set at 60. So that gives us that little bit of a spike right here around 4,000, as you can see, and then it tapers away with actually what the duty cycle looks like on this graph. And that I found that was really convenient, you know, for this discussion, and that's great. But the thing is, in different gears, the boost curve is going to look different, and so I drew simulated boost curves based on experience in many dyno pulls on here. Now what we have is ignore the green for now. But if you were to take that same black line that we saw here, probably done in 4th gear on the dyno, and you did the pull in, say, 2nd gear, the turbo would take longer to reach full boost. Okay. Now, the tuner could, in theory, hold 98% duty cycle all the way to 4,400 RPM if you wanted to increase how fast it came in 2nd gear, and that curve might move to the left a little bit. But what happens then in 4th gear is that when the turbo is already near peak boost, you slide 90% on, the turbo is going to overshoot. Okay. Now that same thing happens if the tuner calibrates the wastegate duty cycle for 4th gear and doesn't take into consideration that you might be one of those guys that will go into 5th gear, hold it at 2,000 RPM, and punch it and wait for boost to show up. Well, in that case, what you're going to get is probably one of these curves here. Where the boost comes in much earlier, it spikes because the duty cycle is still at 90 like you saw on that table. It spikes way up until the system realizes, oh crap, I got to start pulling duty cycle down. Well, when the duty cycle needed to maintain boost is only 60 or 50, right? It's going to start pulling duty cycle down off of that that 90, and it's going to take a while because it's really got to get down into the 60s or less than that. And so the spike's going to keep happening. And then eventually it'll turn around and come down, and by now it's already just pulling a ton of duty cycle out, and you might get an underswing, and then eventually it'll stabilize and have something like that. Now, that's not uncommon. You know, that's super common to people that drive it and lug it down. And so as a tuner, we got to say, okay, well, you know, either I sacrifice spool by reducing the duty cycle to 90% at less than 3,000, and then bring around 60 for the rest of the range, you know, to protect the guys on top. Or if the ECU has a wastegate duty by gear feature, well then it's gravy, right? Let's make sure that in 6th gear I move that peak, you know, to the left more, and in the lower gears I move the peak to the right to help get that turbo spool as fast as possible. And that works really good. But unfortunately, Subarus in the factory don't have that option. And a lot of cars from the factory don't have that option. They don't have a per gear duty cycle compensation. And so what happens is that you have to, as a calibrator, try and weigh, you know, that lag versus spike, you know, threshold. And so sometimes they will tune it for 1 through 5 with no spike, and understand that 6 is going to have one if someone smashes on it in 6th gear, which is not how you should drive a car. But what they can do to try and compensate for this is, therefore, at these high loads, low RPM, pull a bunch of timing out of it, and that helps. But you know, you can still damage the car. So what kind of damage can you do? Well, you can fold a rod, for example. If for some reason you just have way too big of a spike and your rods can't handle the load, you can break a rod in the engine. And that's actually happened to a customer of mine the other day. And I did do per gear compensation on the car, but it was also like 30 degrees the night that he was out goofing around. He was in 5th or 6th gear at no RPM, and he was down 2,000 feet less than we tuned the car for. And even with only 5 degrees of timing on the car, it still folded a rod and broke the rod. And really, if the guy would have just downshifted another gear, never would have happened, never would have been an issue. And which brings me to a point on how to drive a turbo car. If you have the need to go fast, if you need to accelerate quickly, then you need to put the engine in the area where it has the most horsepower. Not necessarily the most torque, but the most horsepower. Okay? If I was to take my Corvette, for example, to the drag strip, and it has a pretty flat torque curve from the bottom to the top, and I shifted at peak torque every time, which is going to be around 40-something hundred RPM, then the car would run significantly slower in the quarter mile than if I shifted closer to 6,300 RPM. Okay, now torque is actually going down a little bit up there, but the horsepower is high and everything, and the car would do a much faster quarter mile time if I shifted at the proper point. And so what I'm saying is, there's no reason if I need to go fast for me to sit at less than 4,000 RPM because I'm not getting the acceleration I want. And so going full throttle at less than $4,000 in my car would make no sense. If I want peak horsepower, that's why I put my foot to the floor, I need to put the engine in the RPM range where it's going to make the most horsepower and give me the most output. And the other thing is, if you're in a high gear, or in any gear really other than first or maybe second, if you put your foot to the floor and you're waiting for boost and you find yourself waiting and dealing with turbo lag, well, you're in the wrong gear, because there's always a gear lower that should put you in the RPM range where the boost is going to come in quick. So if you ever say, oh yeah, I just dropped it into 5th and put my foot on it and waited for the boost to show up and waited for the power to come, you're doing it wrong. You're going to break something. So remember, if you have gears below it, below the one you're in, you should be downshifting into them, and you should put the engine in the RPM range where you want the power. If you're only going to go half throttle, there's no reason to have an engine up to 7,000 RPM if you're half throttle, right? Because you're only asking for half of what the engine has. So there's no reason to be up there. And conversely to that, there's no reason to be at full throttle at 1,000 RPM unless you're in first gear, right? You got to take off a stop sign somehow, or off the light. Hopefully you're not taking off from a stop sign at full throttle. But on the drag strip, for example, Yeah, full throttle from the very bottom. And even then, you probably should be slipping the clutch some and, you know, having launch control set at 4,000 RPM or something. But really, in no case is full throttle at 1,000 RPM really going to be a good idea. If you need full power, you should be in the RPM range where the power is made. So just think about that when you're driving your cars. I know that turbo cars are different. They take a lot of getting used to, but there's a lot of power density in a 4-cylinder turbo car, or any turbo car really, because you're putting in more atmospheres than an NA engine of the same volume would have. And so because of that, you put a lot more stresses, you have a lot more cylinder pressures, a lot more strain on all the components, and if you hit one of these spikes on pump gas, you know, even if your tuner is careful, you could still cause detonation, you could just overpressurize it, you could fill the rod, you could squirt a head gasket gun, you could split a cylinder. There's so many things you could do, and just driving the car properly could prevent you from damaging the engine and costing yourself thousands and thousands of dollars. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me at Dominic@GetaDomTune.com or visit our Facebook page and Tier 1 Imports and GetaDomTune.com. Thanks.